On August 15, 2019, at 2:47 p.m., American Airlines Flight 2847 was crossing the skies over Kansas when something extraordinary happened. Captain Michael Rodriguez, a veteran with over 20 years of experience, looked out the cockpit window and his heart nearly stopped. There, among the dense clouds that formed like celestial cotton, an imposing figure stood out with an indescribable clarity. 157 passengers witnessed what many called a miracle, while others questioned whether it was merely a meteorological coincidence. What you are about to hear forever changed the lives of everyone on that plane. This is a true story, a story that challenges our understanding of faith, science, and the mysteries that still surround our existence. Michael Rodriguez was born into a deeply Catholic family in San Antonio, Texas. His grandmother, Maria Elena Rodriguez, was a fervent devotee of the Virgin Mary, and from a young age, Michael grew up hearing stories about Marian apparitions around the world. Fatima, Lourdes, Guadalupe, all these stories were part of his upbringing, even if, over the years, he became more skeptical of supernatural phenomena. By the age of 43, Michael had already flown over 15,000 hours, navigating storms, facing severe turbulence, and dealing with emergencies that would test the nerves of even the most experienced pilot. He was a practical, scientific man who firmly believed in aviation as an exact science, with no room for mysteries or supernatural explanations. That Thursday in August, the flight had departed Denver bound for Atlanta, a route Michael knew like the back of his hand. The sky was partly cloudy, with cumulus clouds typical of the American Midwest during the summer. The cruising altitude was 37,000 feet, and everything was proceeding perfectly normally. It was exactly 2:47 p.m. when Michael looked to the right side of the aircraft and saw something that left him completely perplexed. Among the clouds, the silhouette of a woman wearing a cloak loomed clearly, her arms outstretched in a position he immediately recognized. It was identical to the images of the Virgin Mary he had seen in his childhood church, but this figure was colossal in size, stretching at least 3 miles across the nebulous formation. Michael's first reaction was to question his own sanity. Perhaps it was fatigue, perhaps an optical illusion caused by the atmospheric conditions. But when he blinked several times and shook his head, the image remained clear and impressive. It was so detailed that he could make out the folds of the cloak and even a serene expression on the figure's face. Unsure of what to do, Michael called his co-pilot, David Chen, a 32-year-old military academy graduate known for his unwavering rationality. "David," Michael said in a shaky voice, "you're seeing what I'm seeing on the right side of the aircraft." David looked where Michael was pointing, and his expression changed completely. "My God, Captain, that's really what I think it is." The cockpit was silent for a few seconds, both pilots absorbing the magnitude of what they were witnessing. David, a self-proclaimed agnostic and rarely thought about spiritual matters, felt a shiver run down his spine. The figure in the clouds wasn't just a meteorological coincidence. It was too detailed, too specific, to be explained by conventional science alone. It was then that the passengers began to notice. The first was Sarah Martinez, a nurse from Miami who was returning home after visiting family in Colorado. Sarah occupied seat 14A and had a privileged view of the right side of the aircraft. When she looked out the window and saw the formation, her first instinct was to call the flight attendant. "Excuse me," Sarah said in English, "could you come here for a moment? There's something very strange out there." The flight attendant, Jennifer Walsh, a seasoned 41-year-old who had flown for over 15 years, approached, expecting to see perhaps turbulence or some technical problem. When she looked out the window, her legs nearly gave out. Within minutes, the news spread throughout the cabin. Passengers rose from their seats, trying to see out the window, while others pulled out their phones to try to photograph the phenomenon. Robert Thompson, a meteorology professor at the University of Georgia who was on board, peered out the window with his scientific knowledge and was completely baffled. As a meteorology professor with 25 years of experience, Robert had studied every type of cloud formation. He knew cumulus, stratus, cirrus, all the possible classifications and variations. But what he was seeing defied any conventional scientific explanation. The clouds were behaving in a completely atypical way, maintaining a specific shape for much longer than would naturally be possible. Also on board was Isabella Rossi, an Italian journalist specializing in religious phenomena, who was traveling to Atlanta to cover a conference on Marian apparitions. Isabella had dedicated her career to investigating alleged miracles and apparitions around the world, always with scientific skepticism, but also with respect for people's spiritual experiences. When Isabella saw the formation, she immediately began documenting everything. She grabbed her notebook and began writing in detail about what she was observing, noting the time, the visible atmospheric conditions, the behavior of the other passengers, and anything that might be relevant for further investigation. If you're interested in stories like this, which challenge our understanding of the spiritual world, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our reports on miracles and unexplained phenomena. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Michael was facing a professional dilemma. He should report the phenomenon to air traffic control. As an experienced pilot, he knew that any anomaly should be reported, but how could he explain that he was seeing the Virgin Mary in the clouds without sounding completely irrational? After a few minutes of hesitation, Michael decided to make contact. Kansas City Center, this is American Flight 2847, reporting an unusual nebula formation at our current location. The response came immediately. American 2847, Kansas City Center, specify the nature of the anomaly. Michael took a deep breath before responding. Center, we're observing a cloud formation that exhibits, shall we say, extraordinarily organized characteristics. Air traffic controller James Mitchell had been working for 12 hours that day and initially interpreted the communication as another routine weather report. But when Michael insisted that the formation was truly exceptional, James decided to check the weather radar. What James saw on his screen left him equally perplexed. The cloud formation appeared on the radar with a density and organization he had never seen in his 15 years of experience as a controller. It was as if the clouds were following a specific pattern, maintaining a structural coherence impossible according to the laws of conventional meteorology. James immediately contacted other flights in the region to see if they were also observing the phenomenon. Delta Flight 1205, which was approximately 50 miles to the north, confirmed that it could see an unusual cloud formation, although from its vantage point, it could not make out specific details. Back on American Flight 2847, the situation in the cockpit was becoming increasingly intense. Passengers of different religions and cultural backgrounds had completely different reactions to the phenomenon. Some Catholics began praying the rosary, other Protestant passengers began spontaneous prayers, while some remained skeptical, trying to find scientific explanations for what they were seeing. Maria Gonzalez, a 72-year-old woman traveling to Atlanta to visit her daughter, began to cry emotionally. Maria had lost her husband 3 months earlier and was experiencing a period of profound spiritual pain, questioning her faith and the meaning of life. When she saw the figure in the clouds, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in months. On the other hand, Dr. Kevin Wright, a Chicago neurosurgeon known for his skepticism toward religious phenomena, was determined to find a rational explanation. He began questioning other passengers about what exactly they were seeing, trying to identify inconsistencies in their reports that might indicate a mass delusion or a psychological phenomenon. Interestingly, all the passengers who saw the formation described essentially the same image: a female figure wearing a cloak, with her arms outstretched, in a position clearly reminiscent of traditional depictions of the Virgin Mary. There were no significant variations in the reports, making the mass delusion explanation much less likely. Father Thomas O'Sullivan, a 61-year-old Catholic priest returning from a spiritual retreat in Colorado, observed the situation with a mixture of admiration and caution. Father Thomas had studied theology for decades and was deeply familiar with the Catholic tradition surrounding Marian apparitions. He knew that the Church had very strict criteria for validating alleged apparitions, and that most reported cases did not pass the necessary theological and scientific tests. However, what he was witnessing had characteristics that impressed him. The serenity of the figure, the duration of the apparition, which had already been visible for over 20 minutes, and especially the effect it was having on the people. Father Thomas observed that even passengers who were clearly not religious were being emotionally touched by the experience. Meanwhile, the flight crew was dealing with a situation completely new to their training protocols. Jennifer Walsh, the chief flight attendant, tried to maintain order in the cabin while she herself was deeply impacted by what she saw. Jennifer had grown up in a Methodist family, but like many people, she had drifted away from religion in adulthood. Seeing that figure in the clouds was awakening spiritual feelings she had buried for years. Maria Gonzalez, a 72-year-old woman traveling to Atlanta to visit her daughter, began to cry emotionally. Maria had lost her husband 3 months earlier and was experiencing a period of profound spiritual pain, questioning her faith and the meaning of life. When she saw the figure in the clouds, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in months. On the other hand, Dr. Kevin Wright, a Chicago neurosurgeon known for his skepticism toward religious phenomena, was determined to find a rational explanation. He began questioning other passengers about what exactly they were seeing, trying to identify inconsistencies in their reports that might indicate a mass delusion or a psychological phenomenon. Interestingly, all the passengers who saw the formation described essentially the same image: a female figure wearing a cloak, with her arms outstretched, in a position clearly reminiscent of traditional depictions of the Virgin Mary. There were no significant variations in the reports, making the mass delusion explanation much less likely. Father Thomas O'Sullivan, a 61-year-old Catholic priest returning from a spiritual retreat in Colorado, observed the situation with a mixture of admiration and caution. Father Thomas had studied theology for decades and was deeply familiar with the Catholic tradition surrounding Marian apparitions. He knew that the Church had very strict criteria for validating alleged apparitions, and that most reported cases did not pass the necessary theological and scientific tests. However, what he was witnessing had characteristics that impressed him. The serenity of the figure, the duration of the apparition, which had already been visible for over 20 minutes, and especially the effect it was having on the people. Father Thomas observed that even passengers who were clearly not religious were being emotionally touched by the experience. Meanwhile, the flight crew was dealing with a situation completely new to their training protocols. Jennifer Walsh, the chief flight attendant, tried to maintain order in the cabin while she herself was deeply impacted by what she saw. Jennifer had grown up in a Methodist family, but like many people, she had drifted away from religion in adulthood. Seeing that figure in the clouds was awakening spiritual feelings she had buried for years. Our next videos will cover other similar cases of Marian apparitions recorded by multiple witnesses. If you want to stay up to date with these fascinating stories, click the subscribe button now. At 3:30 p.m., Michael Rodriguez received instructions from air traffic control to slightly alter his route due to a storm developing ahead. This meant the plane would have to move away from the area where the figure was being observed. Michael felt a pang of sadness as he informed the passengers that they would have to change course and would likely miss the sight of the phenomenon. The passengers' reaction was immediate and emotional. Many people asked the pilot to maintain the original route for a few more minutes. Sarah Martinez stood up and asked permission to speak with the captain, explaining that the experience was deeply meaningful to many on board. Father Thomas also offered to speak with the crew about the spiritual significance of the moment. Michael was torn between his professional responsibilities and the realization that he was witnessing something truly exceptional. As a pilot, his top priority was the safety of his passengers, but he also recognized that this experience could be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. After consulting with David and checking the weather conditions, Michael decided to request a few additional minutes from air traffic control before changing course. Kansas City Center, this is American 2847, requesting permission to maintain current course for an additional 5 minutes before executing the course change. We have a special situation on board that requires a few additional minutes. Controller James Mitchell, already intrigued by reports of the cloud formation, granted the request, coordinating with other flights in the area to ensure proper separation. During those final 5 minutes, something truly remarkable happened. The figure in the clouds seemed to bow its head slightly, as if in a gesture of farewell. Multiple passengers observed this change simultaneously, and many interpreted it as a sign that the apparition was acknowledging the devotion and attention it had received. Maria Gonzalez, the grieving woman, felt at that moment a profound certainty that her late husband was at peace. For months she had carried the anguish of not knowing if he had suffered during his last moments in the hospital, but watching that serene figure in the clouds, she felt a spiritual confirmation that he was okay and that she could move on with her life. Isabella Rossi continued documenting every detail, but even she, accustomed to maintaining professional distance when investigating religious phenomena, was emotionally moved by the experience. As a journalist, she had seen many people claim to have witnessed miracles, but rarely had she observed such a genuine and uniform emotional response among such a diverse group of witnesses. Dr. Robert Thompson made his final meteorological observations before the course change. The formation had remained stable for over 40 minutes, an extraordinarily long period for any type of cumulus cloud. Furthermore, atmospheric conditions had not changed significantly during this period, making the stability even more inexplicable from a conventional scientific perspective. At 3:35 p.m., Michael finally initiated the course change. As the plane turned southeast, the figure in the clouds gradually disappeared from the passenger's view. Many people remained staring out the windows until the last possible moment, trying to mentally record every detail of the experience they had just had. The rest of the flight to Atlanta was completely different from normal. Passengers who usually remained isolated in their seats began spontaneous conversations about what they had witnessed. People from different religious, cultural, and socio-economic backgrounds shared their impressions and feelings about the experience. Father Thomas circulated throughout the cabin, offering spiritual comfort to anyone who wanted it. He noticed that even people who declared themselves non-religious were asking profound questions about spirituality and the meaning of life. The experience had awakened existential questions that many of these people had suppressed for years. Dr. Kevin Wright, who had begun the flight as a staunch skeptic, was now in deep reflection. As a neurosurgeon, he was accustomed to dealing with life-and-death situations, but he rarely thought about the spiritual dimensions of human existence. The experience was forcing him to consider possibilities beyond his materialistic scientific training. Sarah Martinez felt transformed. The nurse had boarded the plane carrying months of depression and hopelessness related to the personal problems she was facing. Now, she felt renewed hope and a certainty that her life had a greater purpose. She decided to seek professional help to deal with her personal problems and work to rebuild her life in a more positive way. Isabella Rossi was already planning how she would investigate the case further. As a journalist specializing in religious phenomena, she knew she would need to interview all possible witnesses, consult experts in meteorology, psychology, and theology, and document the case in a way that could be seriously analyzed by the academic community. Margaret Foster, the retired professor who had felt her late mother's presence during the experience, decided she would write a letter to her daughter, from whom she had become estranged after her grandmother's death. The experience had shown her the importance of maintaining family ties and not letting pride or petty resentments destroy important relationships. When the plane landed in Atlanta at 5:23 p.m., a unique atmosphere prevailed among the passengers. Normally, people immediately stand up, grab their luggage, and quickly exit the plane, eager to reach their final destinations. But that day, many remained seated for a few extra minutes, as if reluctant to end the shared experience they had shared. Several passengers exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch and share how the experience would continue to impact their lives. An informal group decided to meet on the first anniversary of the experience to reflect on how those moments had influenced their personal trajectories. Michael Rodriguez and David Chen remained in the cockpit for a few minutes after all passengers had disembarked, processing what had happened. As professional pilots, they knew they would have to officially report the incident, but they were concerned about how their careers might be affected if they reported seeing a religious apparition during the flight. The flight crew was also deeply impacted. Jennifer Walsh, who had distanced herself from religion for years, decided she would visit a church the following Sunday. She felt the experience had rekindled a spiritual dimension of her life that she had neglected, and she wanted to explore those feelings more deeply. In the days following the flight, Isabella Rossi began her detailed journalistic investigation. She contacted American Airlines, Kansas City Air Traffic Control, and meteorologists in the region, and began scheduling interviews with all passengers willing to share their accounts of the experience. American Airlines initially tried to downplay the incident, concerned about potential legal implications or damage to the company's reputation. But when it became clear that multiple credible witnesses were reporting the same experience, the company decided to cooperate with independent investigations. Dr. Amanda Peterson, the psychologist who had heard about the case at the airport, offered to conduct a psychological analysis of the witnesses. She was particularly interested in determining whether there were signs of mass hysteria, mass suggestion, or other psychological phenomena that could explain the uniform reports among such diverse people. The National Weather Service also took an interest in the case. Meteorologists were intrigued by reports of the exceptional stability of the nebula formation and wanted to analyze the day's atmospheric data to try to find scientific explanations for the observed phenomenon. Father Thomas O'Sullivan reported the incident to the Archdiocese of Atlanta, which in turn reported the matter to the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The Catholic Church has rigorous procedures for investigating alleged Marian apparitions, involving theologians, doctors, psychologists, and other experts to determine whether there is any basis for considering the event supernatural. 3 weeks after the flight, Isabella Rossi had interviewed 112 of the 157 passengers on board. The accounts were remarkably consistent in terms of the visual details observed, but varied significantly in terms of personal interpretations and emotional impact of the experience. All interviewees who managed to see the formation described essentially the same image: a female figure wearing a cloak, with her arms initially extended in a welcoming position, then shifting to a posture reminiscent of the iconography of Our Lady of Grace. There was also consensus on the approximate duration of the sighting, about 40 minutes, and on the smaller nebulous formations that appeared to form roses around the main figure. Interpretations, however, varied widely. Catholics present clearly interpreted it as an apparition of the Virgin Mary. Protestants and other Christians tended to see it as a divine manifestation, but not always specifically Marian. People of other faiths or with no specific religious affiliation interpreted it as a significant spiritual phenomenon, but not necessarily Christian. If you are fascinated by these stories of unexplained phenomena and apparitions, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our investigations into contemporary miracles. What was particularly interesting to Dr. Amanda Peterson was that even the most skeptical people had been emotionally impacted by the experience. Dr. Kevin Wright, for example, continued to maintain that there must be a scientific explanation for the phenomenon, but admitted that the experience had caused him to reflect more deeply on spiritual matters. 6 months after the incident, Isabella Rossi published a detailed book about the case, titled Miracle at 37,000 Feet, The Kansas City Apparition. The book became an international bestseller and sparked intense debate among scientists, theologians, psychologists, and the general public about the nature of spiritual phenomena in the modern era. Dr. Robert Thompson, the meteorologist on board, spent months analyzing the atmospheric data from that day. He consulted with colleagues from several universities and meteorological institutions, but was never able to find a satisfactory scientific explanation for the exceptional stability and specific organization of the observed nebula formation. In his final report, Dr. Thompson concluded that while unusual meteorological phenomena can occasionally create formations that resemble recognizable figures, the duration, stability, and specificity of the details observed on American Flight 2847 were beyond what could be explained by conventional atmospheric science. The Catholic Church's investigation took 2 years to complete. The investigative commission included theologians, doctors, psychologists, meteorologists, and other experts. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, analyzed all available data, and consulted with international experts in atmospheric phenomena and mass psychology. The Church's official conclusion was cautiously positive. While they did not formally declare the experience an authentic Marian apparition, they acknowledged that the event had characteristics that could not be fully explained by known natural or psychological causes, and that the positive spiritual fruits observed in the lives of the witnesses were consistent with authentic spiritual experiences. Michael Rodriguez continued to fly for American Airlines, but the experience profoundly changed his perspective on life and spirituality. He became more religious, returning to the Catholic practice of his youth, and frequently spoke about the incident with other pilots, always emphasizing that he had seen something that challenged his scientific understanding of the world. David Chen, the co-pilot, was also deeply impacted. He began studying different spiritual traditions, seeking to better understand experiences that transcend purely material explanations. Although he never converted to a specific religion, he developed a spiritual openness he hadn't possessed before the experience. Sarah Martinez, the nurse who had been one of the first to observe the figure, underwent a remarkable personal transformation. She sought therapy to deal with her personal issues, reconciled amicably with her ex-husband, and found a new professional direction working with palliative care patients, where she felt she could offer spiritual comfort beyond medical care. Father Thomas O'Sullivan became a leading advocate for the authenticity of the experience within the Catholic community. He wrote several theological articles on the case and frequently lectured on how contemporary Marian apparitions can occur in modern contexts, including commercial aviation. His perspective was that the Virgin Mary chose to manifest herself where and when people most needed hope and spiritual guidance. Margaret Foster re-established the relationship with her daughter and grandchildren, which had deteriorated after her mother's death. The experience convinced her that life is too short to harbor family resentments, and she spent her final years fostering reconciliation and forgiveness within her extended family. Dr. Amanda Peterson published an academic study on the case in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, analyzing the psychological aspects of the collective experience. Her conclusion was that, while collective suggestion phenomena may explain some cases of group sightings, the specific characteristics of American Flight 2847 were inconsistent with mass hysteria or other conventional psychological explanations. What struck Dr. Peterson most was the duration of the positive effects observed in witnesses. Typically, experiences based on collective suggestion have temporary impacts that quickly dissipate when people return to their normal routines. In the case of Flight 2847, many witnesses reported lasting changes in their outlook on life, spiritual practices, and personal relationships, even years after the event. Maria Gonzalez, the grieving woman, lived her last 5 years with a serenity her family hadn't seen in decades. She often spoke of how those moments observing the figure in the clouds had healed her soul from the pain of loss. When she passed away peacefully in 2024, her family reported that her last words were about seeing again the beautiful lady in the clouds who had brought peace to her heart. Isabella Rossi continued investigating similar cases around the world and discovered that, although rare, there were other documented reports of apparitions observed during commercial flights. She identified at least 12 similar cases that had occurred in the last 3 decades, although none with as many witnesses or as detailed documentation as American Flight 2847. The case also attracted the attention of international researchers interested in the intersection of spirituality and aviation. Dr. Henri Dubois, a French psychologist specializing in high-altitude spiritual experiences, has begun a research project on how the unique conditions of commercial flights, including altitude, isolation, personal reflection, and expansive perspectives of Earth, can create environments conducive to transcendental experiences. 5 years after the event, American Airlines quietly installed a small commemorative plaque in the maintenance hangar where aircraft N847AA was overhauled, acknowledging that something extraordinary had happened during that flight. While the company never made an official statement about the supernatural nature of the event, they acknowledged the positive impact the experience had on many people's lives. Jennifer Walsh, the chief flight attendant, eventually left commercial aviation to work at a spiritual retreat center in New Mexico. She frequently shared her experience on Flight 2847 with visitors seeking spiritual guidance, emphasizing how unexpected moments of transcendence can occur anywhere, even at 37,000 feet. Kansas City Air Traffic Control developed special protocols to handle reports of unusual atmospheric phenomena, recognizing that not all aerial events can be explained by conventional meteorology. James Mitchell, the controller who had coordinated Flight 2847, became an advocate for keeping detailed records of atmospheric anomalies that could have significance beyond immediate scientific explanations. Dr. Kevin Wright, the initially skeptical neurosurgeon, underwent a gradual but profound transformation. While continuing to practice evidence-based medicine, he began incorporating elements of spiritual care into his patient care, recognizing that healing often involves dimensions that transcend the purely physical. He established a program at his hospital to train physicians on how to address patients' spiritual needs. The experience of Flight 2847 also inspired academic studies on the relationship between collective spiritual experiences and lasting behavioral changes. Researchers at Stanford University conducted a longitudinal study following 43 of the witnesses for 10 years, documenting how the experience continued to influence their life choices, spiritual practices, and personal relationships. The results showed that 78% of the witnesses reported lasting positive changes in their lives that they attributed directly to the experience on the plane. These changes included increased involvement in spiritual or religious activities, improved family relationships, a greater sense of purpose in life, reduced anxiety about death, and increased altruistic behavior. In 2029, 10 years after the event, survivors organized a commemorative gathering in Kansas City. 42 of the original passengers and crew members attended, along with family members and researchers who had studied the case. The gathering included lectures on the lasting impacts of the experience, spiritual reflection sessions, and a charter flight that followed the same route as the original event. During the commemorative flight, although no apparitions were observed, many participants reported intense feelings of gratitude and spiritual connection. Sarah Martinez, now director of spiritual care at a major Miami hospital, led an in-flight meditation session, guiding participants through reflections on how the experience had shaped their lives over the previous decade. Michael Rodriguez, who had retired from commercial aviation, served as the keynote speaker at the event. He reflected on how those 40 minutes observing the figure in the clouds had been more meaningful to him than all the other flights of his career combined. He emphasized that, regardless of scientific or religious explanations, the experience had demonstrated the transformative power of moments of shared transcendence. The story of American Airlines Flight 2847 continues to inspire people around the world. Books, documentaries, academic articles, and even a play have been created based on the event. Each artistic or scientific medium that has addressed the story has brought new perspectives on the meaning of the experience and its implications for our understanding of contemporary spirituality. The case has also raised important questions about how our secular society deals with experiences that transcend purely material explanations. Sociologists have noted that many of the witnesses were initially hesitant to share their experiences, fearing skepticism or ridicule, but that mutual support among the witnesses created an environment where they could explore the spiritual meanings of what they had experienced. Religious psychologists have used the case as an example of how authentic spiritual experiences can occur outside of traditional religious contexts, challenging assumptions about where and how the sacred manifests in modern life. The fact that the experience occurred on a commercial airliner, a symbol of modern technology and rationality, has become a point of discussion about the coexistence of faith and science in the contemporary era. Meteorologists continued to study the case, and although they never arrived at a completely satisfactory explanation for the observed atmospheric phenomena, the event contributed to a greater scientific openness to atmospheric anomalies that do not fit neatly into existing meteorological models. The Catholic Church occasionally references the case in discussions of modern Marian apparitions, although it maintains its official cautious stance. Some theologians argue that the case represents a new paradigm for how the divine can manifest itself in the age of global aviation, suggesting that Marian apparitions can adapt to contemporary cultural and technological contexts. Flight 2847's most enduring legacy may be how it demonstrated that profound spiritual experiences can unite people from vastly different backgrounds in moments of shared transcendence. In a time of increasing social and religious polarization, the story offers an example of how the sacred can serve as a point of human connection that transcends denominational, cultural, and ideological differences. 15 years after the event, many of the original witnesses remain in touch, forming a loose community united by their shared experience. They correspond regularly, share important life milestones, and offer mutual support during difficult times. This network of enduring relationships may be one of the most tangible and measurable aspects of the experience's impact. Religious scholars have noted that the case exemplifies how historical Marian apparitions often occurred during periods of social or personal turmoil, offering hope and direction to people facing uncertainty. The fact that the apparition occurred in 2019, shortly before the global COVID-19 pandemic, has led some to speculate whether there was a prophetic element to the experience. Regardless of theological or scientific interpretations, the story of American Airlines Flight 2847 remains a powerful testament to the human capacity for experiences that transcend the ordinary. It reminds us that, even in our advanced technological age, there are still mysteries that defy our understanding and moments that can profoundly transform our lives. For those on the plane that August day, the experience has remained a source of strength, hope, and spiritual connection over the years. For the researchers who studied the case, it remains one of the best documented examples of a collective spiritual experience in modern times. And for all of us who hear this story, it invites us to remain open to the possibilities of transcendence and transformation that can appear in the most unexpected moments of our lives. Perhaps the true lesson of Flight 2847 is not about the exact nature of what was observed in those clouds, but about our shared human capacity to find meaning, hope, and connection in experiences that connect us with something greater than ourselves. The story lives on in the memories of those who experienced it and in the lives of those touched by their accounts. Like all great stories of faith and mystery, it reminds us that the world is wider, deeper, and more wonderful than we often allow ourselves to believe. And perhaps in the end, that's exactly what makes this story so powerful and enduring.